Hello, it's a pleasure to be here, even virtually. I'm sorry I couldn't be here in person. I'm going to be talking about the macroeconomic impact of population aging. And as I'm sure you all know, population aging is occurring all over the world. Not so much in sub-Saharan Africa, but otherwise in all regions of the world. And here we see plots of the ratio of people over 65 to people of conventional working age 20 to 64 from United Nations data and projections. Japan is the oldest country in the world of any size, and you can see here the green line that between 2010, that in 2010 this ratio was 0.4, that is for each working age person there were 0.4 elderly, and by 2050 that ratio is going to double so that there will be 0.8 older people per working age person. That's an extraordinarily high ratio of elderly to working age. Of course, there's nothing magic about 65 as a boundary of the working age, but we won't be talking so much about that today. You can see the situation in Spain will not be so different at the middle of the century. For Europe as a whole, aging will be more moderate. In North America, aging is much less severe because fertility has generally been higher in the United States. Well, let's move on. Now, population aging affects the macroeconomy in three main ways that I'll be talking about. First of all, population aging goes with slower growth of the labor force, and that translates into slower growth of national output, slower growth of GDP. And it also means an older labor force, which will mean a labor force with different characteristics, maybe more or less efficient, creative, and so on. Second, an older population will translate into a population with more assets or capital held per capita, for reasons I'll talk about later. And in a closed population, this will raise the productivity of labor, and the fact that workers will be becoming more productive will help to offset the fact that there are fewer of them because of population aging. It will raise the wages of workers, and at the same time it will reduce the rate of return to capital, profit rates, and it will reduce the rate of interest, or so it's expected. And this will change the distribution of income in the country. It may cause some problems for the elderly who rely in part on asset income to fund their consumption. The third category of effects is the one that we're most familiar with and that we see most about in the newspapers. That is the problem of rising dependency rates. The elderly certainly consume. They may consume a great deal, but they don't work much. They don't produce much with their labor, and this puts pressure on public sector transfer programs for the elderly, public pensions, publicly provided health care and long-term care, and so on. It will require either higher taxes or lower benefits. And then in some countries, particularly in East Asia, these same forces will put increasing pressure on the family, where the family is primarily responsible for supporting the elderly. So those are the three main categories of effects that I will be talking about. National transfer accounts, the subject of our meeting, provide data that can help to quantify these consequences, but only with the help of a number of additional assumptions, because national transfer accounts describe what is, or try to describe what is, but that's quite different than telling us about the dynamics of change. For those of you who don't know national transfer accounts, let me say a word about them. NTA, I will call them. NTA goes beyond ordinary national income and product accounts because it breaks down national accounts by age and by generation in ways that we'll see in a moment. And in addition, it looks inside the family and household. It looks at private transfer behavior. It looks at the costs to parents of supporting raising their kids. It looks at help that older people may give their adult children, or the reverse. It looks at familial transfers of this sort, and it also looks at public sector transfers, pensions, and so on. And then work in progress uses time-use data to incorporate productive activities in the household and the consumption of cooked dinners as opposed to the food that's just sitting in your refrigerator. So Andy Mason and I co-direct the NTA project. There are research teams now in over 50 countries, many of them represented here today, and the national transfer accounts have been estimated for 80 or 90 countries now, at least partially, and they're created from not by funding and administrating and designing new surveys, but by using existing surveys and administrative data and national income and product accounts. And these kinds of data are used based on methods that are the same across all the countries in the project, and there's some quality control, making sure that everything is done in the same way, and there are training programs and workshops and so on. This map shows the global scope of NTA. The gray countries are countries that have NTA teams, and the yellow countries are countries for which NTA estimates have been made, but which don't yet have teams that are members of NTA. And you can see that the coverage is very broad, except for parts of Africa. These are some recent publications, and in particular that one in the middle is a United Nations manual that describes how these accounts are done and provides a lot of detailed information. And the purple book has a lot of substantive articles and about the estimates in a number of countries. And this is a science article on the right. Okay. So NTA starts with a budget identity that you could think of as applying to any of you out there in the audience, or I can think of as applying to me, or it applies to aggregates of people, say whole age groups or generations, cohorts in the population, and it applies to a nation as well. So it says that asset income plus labor income plus transfers received must equal consumption plus transfers given plus saving. And each of these items can be broken down into public sector and private sector. And NTA estimates these quantities at every age and broken down in more detail. There are different kinds of assets, their housing services, their financial dividends and interest, and so on and so forth. And we call, by age profile, we mean the average value of each of these inflows or outflows, or their difference by age. So I'll show you some of these in a moment. So what is in these quantities? Well, consumption includes private household expenditures that are then imputed to individuals in each household, and then to that we add the public in-kind transfers received by each individual, for example, for consumption, healthcare, education, but not pensions, which are income. They're not necessarily consumed. And then labor income is wages and salaries and fringe benefits. It includes self-employment income, and the averages for each age include the zeros for people who don't have any labor income. And then for comparison, we standardize these for each country by dividing by the average level of peak labor income at ages 30 to 49. Okay, and here we have examples of these. And so in the upper left-hand corner here, we have the United States for 2007, chosen as the last year before the Great Recession. And what do we see? Well, that blue line is consumption by age, and you can see that it's low at young ages at the left, and it rises to a high level for old ages at the right. At the right we have age 90, at the left we have 0. And you can also see a little bump at the beginning, which is human capital spending on health and education of children. And you can see that for Japan and Sweden across the top row, in all of them, consumption is rising with age. You can see in the next row, consumption is quite flat with age for Austria, Hungary, and India, for example. That's true for some countries. And then you can see it's also fairly flat with age after childhood in the bottom row. Now, the orange line is labor income by age. And you can see that it has different shapes in different countries. It starts at younger ages in low-income countries. It starts at older ages in higher-income countries. It peaks at different ages, and so on. You can see Japan looks quite different than the US. And Costa Rica has a very long tail to the right. People stay in the labor force a long time. And Austria, people retire early, and they also start to work early, and so on. Hungary has a particularly rectangular age profile, and Robert Gall here has a theory about that. You notice in China, the labor income profile peaks very far. It's sort of all smushed to the left. It peaks at an early age. And that's because China's a country that's had extremely rapid increase in educational enrollment, college completion, and so on. And it's also had extremely rapid economic growth, and that has mostly accrued, the benefits have accrued mostly to younger workers. And so you get this strange shape. And for my purposes today, I will view that as a distorted shape. I have to assume that that shape will change in the future as the rate of economic growth slows down and so on. So it would be a poor assumption to assume that that age profile retains its shape, which is the assumption I will be making in most cases. So the basic strategy is to assume that that shape stays the same, although the level of the age profiles may change. Now, population, I'm going to look at the effects of population aging in 3 different ways. And the simplest way is what's called the support ratio. We use, for some country, the age profile of consumption and the age profile of labor income. And we multiply these by the population age distribution, and that gives us the number of effective workers and the number of effective consumers. And the ratio of these two is the support ratio. Now, this is of interest because as the population age distribution changes, but these age profiles remain the same, as the population age distribution changes, then this support ratio is going to change. And so, for example, as populations age, that's going to raise the effective consumers a lot because the elderly continue to consume, but it won't raise the number of effective consumers so much because the elderly don't work, and so the support ratio will decline. For the US, here I plot the growth rate of the number of effective workers. So, and we see the effect of the baby boom moving through the age distribution. This goes from 1950, projected all the way up to 2100. And during these years, say from 1970 through 2010, we see the baby boom moving through the labor force and leading to a rapid rate of increase of the labor force. Labor force is growing at about 1.5% per year. Then as the baby boom moves out of the labor force and into retirement, which it's almost now done doing here in 2017, we're down here. From now on, the labor force will be growing at less than 0.5% a year. So there's a huge drop in the rate of growth in the labor force, and that will translate into a drop in the rate of GDP growth. Now, we can do the same thing for consumption. Here's the rate of growth of effective consumers. That rate of growth was very high as the baby boom was being born because consuming kids were being added to the population. It was lower as the baby boomers moved through the labor force, but it remained at more than 1% per year after the baby boomers retired. And so during this period, you can see that the number of effective consumers is growing more rapidly, and the support ratio is going to fall. And we see these patterns in the support ratio for the US. Support ratio declining at first, then rising, and then declining again. And it looks just the same whether we use age profiles from 1981 or we use age profiles from 2007. Now here are support ratios for some other countries. We see Nigeria with a support ratio that's going to be increasing throughout the century. That's the so-called demographic dividend. We see India still experiencing a rising support ratio, a demographic dividend, but that will end around 2040. And we see other countries with the support ratio falling, reflecting population aging. So moderate aging in the US, sharp aging in China, Japan, and Spain. And this aging, well, in the US, it's subtracting about 0.5% per year from consumption, per capita consumption. But in Spain, it's subtracting about 0.5% per year. And in Nigeria, it's adding about 1/3% per year. Now, we might question that support ratio as a portrayal of the costs of population aging. I question it because I don't think the elderly are really fully dependent on workers to fund their consumption. The elderly also have assets and asset income. They've been saving throughout their lives to some degree. They inherit from their parents at some point. They experience capital gains when housing prices rise, and so on. And in all these ways, the elderly come to hold substantial asset income when they're older. This was shown, I didn't mention it, but this is the gray line, that's asset income. And so you see in the US how it's people over 60 who have high asset income. In Japan, it's also people in old age who have high asset income. And to a lesser degree, you see the same pattern in Sweden, you see it in India. In Hungary, it's very different for some reason. In Austria, it's rather different for some reason. But the typical pattern is as I describe it. Now, so they hold most of these assets, and I'm going to assume that as populations age, the new elderly arriving at old age are bringing the assets with them in accord with what these asset income profiles show. So just as younger people bring their labor to the labor market, but not much in the way of assets, so the elderly don't bring much labor to the market, but they bring a lot of assets to the market. And these assets are increase production. The general support ratio is a different kind of support ratio that reflects this for an economy. And here it assumes that markets are open. When markets are open, it means that the rate of return on capital and wage rates will be set on the international market. And that will be done by flows of capital into and out of countries. In that case, we can just use the baseline wages and interest rates to attach value to the contributions of labor and assets. So using the asset income profile and the effective savings profile, we can construct effective asset income and effective savings in the same way we did effective workers and effective consumers. And then as the population ages, there will be an increase in effective asset income. And we're interested in the extent to which the elderly are dependent versus providing for their own consumption. And if they save all their asset income, then they're still depending on the working age population. So we subtract off effective savings. And that gives the general support ratio. And that looks like this. So in the United States, in the upper left-hand corner, you see that here we're looking at changes from 2010 to 2050, indexed to 1.0 in 2010. And if you looked very closely, you could see that the ordinary support ratio drops by 12% over that 40-year period, but the general support ratio only drops by 4%. A lot of the drop in the availability of labor is offset by increased availability of asset income. On the other hand, you see in some countries like Austria, Sweden, Finland, Slovenia, and Hungary, there's hardly any difference between the two lines. In these countries, the elderly are not relying on their asset income to fund their consumption. They're saving their asset income. They have asset income in some of these countries, but they're saving it, and instead they're relying on public sector transfers to fund their consumption. Well, in these countries, what's going to happen is that when these older people die, they will have substantial assets, which will then, after taxes, be passed on to their children, who will then benefit in that, let's say, indirect way from the saving of their elderly parents. And a similar story, let's see, the U.S. is somewhat similar to Germany, to Spain, to South Korea, places where the older people are consuming in part out of their asset income. Now, a third approach is what I call the impact index, it's just like the general support ratio, except now we incorporate some economic feedbacks, assuming the economy is closed, so that as the assets per person rise in the economy, that's going to lead to higher wages and lower interest rates. We say this is the result of capital intensification. And we can calculate these effects assuming a simple production function, and I won't go into any of those details. And we can derive many estimates under these assumptions, total output, per capita output, and so on. The most complete measure and the most comparable to what we've been looking at is what I call the impact index, which is the effect on consumption per effective consumer. That's the same as that outcome measure for the general support ratio. Now first, this chart just shows the effect of population aging in different countries on the wage interest ratio. That is, it reflects the degree to which there has been an increase in the capital labor ratio, in capital deepening. And this degree is greater in countries that are at earlier stages of the demographic transition. That is, aging hasn't yet really begun to take hold, and Costa Rica and Mexico would be in that category. But also Latin American countries are different in various respects, which are also reflected here. So we see for Costa Rica and Mexico, there's more than a 60 to more than an 80% increase in that wage interest ratio. In the U.S., there's about a 30 to 40% increase by mid-century. In Sweden and Japan, there is a 10 to 20% increase by mid-century. China, I think I will, for the reasons I gave before, I shouldn't even have included here, I won't discuss. Now that's going on in the background. Here I show you another sort of intermediate outcome. This is the effect on per capita income. So we see in Mexico, the gray line, a big positive effect on per capita income. That's still the demographic dividend taking place over the next 50 years. In Costa Rica, we see something similar. In Thailand, we see something similar, but ending much earlier, because Thailand started its demographic transition and fertility decline long ago and is farther along in the aging process. And then down here, let's concentrate on Germany, Japan, and Sweden. These lower countries have substantial declines in per capita income of 10 to 20% as a result of population aging. Now, this is not the same, however, as consumption per equivalent or effective consumer, which is what I'm interested in looking at as the outcome. And there are two differences. First of all, the elderly may be saving, or generally in countries, varying amounts of output may be saved, and as populations age, savings rates may rise in some countries or decline in others. And the other difference is that not all consumers are equal. In many countries, such as the US, Sweden, and Japan, the elderly consume substantially more than younger adults. So when the proportion of elderly in the population rises, that denominator in consumption per effective consumer, the number of effective consumers goes up more than in proportion to the population. Okay, so here we have a plot of all three of these outcome measures I've discussed: the support ratio, the general support ratio, and the impact index. For the U.S., the impact index and the general support ratio are virtually indistinguishable, and as before, we see that when you take capital deepening, capital intensification into account, the effects of population aging are more than cut in half by these measures. For Thailand, you can see that taking capital into account dramatically changes the picture. This is partly because Thailand has very limited public sector transfers to the elderly. Most of their public sector is focused on children. And so the elderly in Thailand draw on their asset income a lot to fund their own consumption and also to help their adult children. In other countries, you can see a more mixed story. But if we look at Japan, we can see that capital softens the consequence of population aging, but it remains fairly substantial. In Sweden, with the impact index, it turns out the impact of population aging is even more severe than the support ratio would indicate. And in Austria, the impact index makes aging look a little bit less costly, similarly for Hungary, and so on. Now, so we have these three measures. I would say, yes, the capital deepening matters, and most countries are partly open and partly closed, so I expect the future impact to be somewhere in between these two. So to conclude, the costs of population aging are real. They may not be as large as support ratios indicate, but they are inevitable. And we can ask, who is going to bear the costs of population aging? Which generations, which age groups? Well, the answer to that will depend partly on just individual choices and partly on public policies. So on the policy side, if we raise taxes and if we raise the retirement age, such policies would spare the current generations of elderly who will eventually die without having had to bear the costs of aging, and they'll impose higher costs on the current working generations and the generations just in transition to aging themselves. On the other hand, cutting pension benefits would place some of the costs on the current elderly, even though such cuts are extremely difficult politically. On the private side, increased saving by the elderly to leave larger bequests to their adult children would mean that the elderly bear some of the costs. Indeed, they don't need to wait to leave bequests. They can consume less and make inter vivos transfers to their adult children. They could also offset public benefit cuts. So if the public sector tries to address the costs of aging by shifting some of them onto the elderly, by reducing pension benefits or healthcare benefits for the elderly might resist such policies by, in turn, consuming more of their asset income themselves, reducing any transfers they make to their adult kids during their lives, and reducing the assets they would leave as an inheritance to their adult children. So private behavior can offset some of the public policy changes. And increased saving on the part of workers and choosing to delay retirement on the part of workers could save their children, the grandchildren of the current elderly, some of the costs of population aging. Well, these are very difficult questions. They're politically extremely difficult to raise, let alone to address. But in fact, ignoring these issues is itself a kind of decision. It's a decision to put greater costs on the younger generations and, well, let's say, have less cost sharing by the elderly as well as by working age populations. Thank you very much.